The mysterious arrival. The year was 2050, and Earth was about to change in ways no one could have imagined. It started quietly at first. A strange, almost unnoticeable hum echoed in the sky, like a whisper that no one could quite hear. People went about their daily lives, oblivious to the events that were about to unfold. But then the hum grew louder, and the sky began to shift in a way that no one could explain. It was as if the heavens themselves were bending, changing into something unnatural. For days, nothing seemed normal. The sun was blocked out by dark shapes that seemed to hang motionless in the sky, casting long shadows over the earth below. These objects weren't like anything anyone had seen before. No one knew what they were. People stood in awe, confused and frightened, staring at the strange shapes. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. The sounds of the city, cars honking, people talking, the hum of machines, stopped, as if someone had pressed the mute button on the world. It was a silence so thick it felt suffocating. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe it was some kind of natural phenomenon. But soon, the silence became eerie. People started to talk about it. What's going on? Where are the birds? The cars? The noise? Days passed, and still there was no sound. Cities became ghost towns. No one could explain why. The news was flooded with reports of strange occurrences, electrical outages, phone lines going dead, and strange power surges that no one could trace. Governments issued warnings, but there were no answers. People began to panic. The world had never seen anything like this before. In the midst of the chaos, Dr. Emily Park, a renowned scientist specializing in extraterrestrial life, watched the events unfold from her lab. She had always been interested in space, the stars, and the mysteries of the universe, but this was different. She felt a deep, nagging sense that something was coming. Something not human. She spent long hours in her office, examining every piece of data she could find. She knew that the silence wasn't natural. There had to be something out there. A disturbance in the atmosphere, strange electromagnetic pulses, and unidentified objects in the sky. There was no way this was a coincidence, but no one was listening. The authorities were focused on the chaos in the streets, while the rest of the world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't until the fourth day of silence that the first real sign of danger appeared. People reported strange lights flickering in the sky, shapes that moved in impossible ways, as if they were bending the laws of physics. These lights were not airplanes or drones. They didn't make a sound. They simply appeared, hovering in the air, before disappearing into thin air. Dr. Park's curiosity was piqued. This wasn't just a random occurrence. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was sending a message. She quickly gathered a small team of researchers and engineers. They started to look for any signs of communication from the objects in the sky. Could it be a signal? An alien race trying to reach Earth? The more they searched, the more they realized the truth. They were not the only ones watching the sky. The world was waiting, and they were all holding their breath for what came next. Then, on the fifth day, everything changed. The objects in the sky began to move closer. At first, they were small, distant dots, but as the hours passed, they grew larger, taking shape. They were massive, so large that they blocked out the sun entirely. People across the globe stared at the sky, unable to believe their eyes. The shapes were not just hovering in place anymore. They were descending, slowly, steadily, as if they were preparing to land. The first city to experience this terrifying descent was New York. The skies above the city were darkened by the large shapes, casting an unnatural shadow over the streets. People stood frozen in fear, staring up at the sky. The soundless air felt like a pressure building up, ready to explode. And then, it happened. A sudden flash of light lit up the sky, blinding everyone for a moment. When the light faded, the objects were gone. In their place was nothing. The sky was empty again, as if the entire event had never happened. But the damage had already been done. People were shaken, confused, and terrified. What had just happened? Was it a warning? Or worse, an invasion? Dr. Park was at the edge of her seat, glued to her monitors, trying to make sense of it all. She could feel the tension in the air, an energy she couldn't explain. It was as if something was coming, something big, and humanity had no idea what they were up against. She quickly began to gather information, hoping to understand what was happening before it was too late. But no one had answers. The silence continued. The objects were gone, but the world was not the same. People started to fear the unknown, unsure of what these mysterious beings wanted or why they had come. Dr. Park knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The creatures that had arrived were not like anything humanity had ever faced. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were here. The silence was only the start of something much bigger. And as the days passed, Dr. Park's fear grew, because the more she looked into the sky, the more she realized the nightmare of their arrival wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silent invasion. The world was still trembling from the shock of the strange visitors in the sky. In the days that followed the mysterious descent of the dark shapes, the silence remained. But something darker loomed just beneath the surface. It was the kind of quiet that made you question everything, as if the calm was merely a prelude to something far worse. The world's leaders tried to reassure the public, offering explanations that never quite fit the fear gripping everyone. Was it a military exercise? A global experiment? No one knew for sure. But one thing was certain: no one was prepared for what came next. Dr. Emily Park, still trying to piece together the puzzle, was now leading a team of experts. A handful of scientists, engineers, and military personnel who had all been drawn to the strange occurrences. Together, they formed a group known only as the Watchers, their sole mission being to understand what was happening and to protect humanity from the unknown. Dr. Park's team had been working tirelessly in a makeshift underground facility. The world above was in chaos, with governments struggling to maintain control. But in the shadows, something more terrifying was happening. The strange phenomenon wasn't just about silence anymore. It was about presence. The kind of presence that made people feel like they were being watched, always. A strange energy seemed to pulse in the air. At night, the stars themselves flickered erratically, as if something was disturbing the very fabric of space. People whispered that the invaders had already begun their invasion, though not in the way they expected. They were already here, hiding in plain sight, and no one even knew it. It was during an overnight surveillance that Dr. Park and her team made a breakthrough. They had been monitoring electromagnetic frequencies when a sudden spike occurred. It wasn't just noise. It was something different, something alive. It was as if the frequencies were being manipulated by an intelligent force. A thought crossed Dr. Park's mind that hadn't occurred to her before. These creatures didn't just arrive from the sky. They had been here all along, perhaps hidden beneath the surface or even within the earth itself. By morning, the team had already prepared for an expedition. Armed with only their research and a small fleet of drones, they set out to find what lay beneath the surface of the earth, where these invaders might be hiding. The journey took them far from civilization, into deep forests and desolate valleys, where no one dared to go anymore. People said the land felt wrong. The air was heavier, thick with the weight of something unnatural. After hours of searching, they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. Buried deep beneath a mountain, they uncovered an enormous underground structure, old and ancient, but disturbingly advanced. The walls were covered in symbols, some of which seemed to move, twisting and shifting as though they were alive. "It's not just technology," one of the engineers muttered. "It's a living organism." Dr. Park stepped forward, her heart racing. The realization hit her like a wave. The invaders weren't aliens in the traditional sense. They weren't from distant stars or planets far away. No, these creatures had been part of Earth's very own history. They were here long before humanity had even existed. The structure wasn't just a building. It was a part of the Earth itself, a massive, dormant entity that had once been a powerful civilization, and now it seemed to be awakening. The team made their way deeper into the structure, where they discovered the true horror of what lay beneath. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with an eerie rhythm. As they turned a corner, a high-pitched hum filled the air, and the wall suddenly shifted, revealing a massive chamber. Inside, they saw the creatures, alive but dormant. They were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Their bodies were fluid, constantly shifting, almost as if they were made of water, yet they radiated an undeniable presence. Their eyes glowed faintly, but it was their stillness that terrified the team. They were not dead. They were waiting. One of the soldiers, unable to hold back his fear, whispered, "They're not just watching us. They're waiting for something." Dr. Park nodded grimly. She could feel the truth sinking in. These creatures weren't merely observing Earth from above. They had been here all along, waiting for the perfect moment to rise again. And now, that moment had come. Suddenly, a low, deep rumble shook the ground. The creatures began to stir, their forms shifting like liquid, flowing toward the team. Panic spread through the group as they realized the nightmare wasn't just about the creatures. They were connected to the very planet itself. As the walls closed in around them, the team barely escaped with their lives. But the message was clear. Humanity was no longer in control. The creatures had been silencing the Earth for a reason. They were preparing to make their return. And this time, they would not be stopped. Dr. Park stared at the ruins of the structure, her heart pounding. The silence of the past days had not been the calm before a storm. It had been the calm during the storm. The creatures had awakened, and they would not be silenced again. The real invasion had only just begun. The first attack. The world was no longer the same. The silence that had once seemed like a warning had now become an ominous calm. People moved through their days, always looking over their shoulders, waiting for something they couldn't quite understand. News reports were filled with speculation, but there was no clarity. Some believed the creatures had gone back into hiding, while others feared they were preparing for something worse. Then, without warning, the first attack came. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was almost too quiet. Cities across the globe experienced strange disruptions, lights flickering, power grids failing, and airwaves filled with nothing but static. The most terrifying part: no one saw the attack coming. No explosions, no flashes of light, just a sudden, terrifying absence of everything. The first city to fall was London. One moment it was business as usual, people going about their daily lives, the hum of traffic, the chatter of the crowd. And then, in the blink of an eye, it all stopped. The power went out, phones went dead, and above it all, a deep, unnatural silence took hold. Those who ventured outside after the blackout described an unsettling sight. Buildings standing tall, perfectly intact, but completely deserted. People vanished as if the city had swallowed them whole. It wasn't just that the streets were empty. It was as though no one had ever been there at all. The eerie stillness of the place sent chills down the spine of anyone who dared step foot in the abandoned city. Dr. Emily Park, back in the underground facility, watched in horror as the reports came in. This wasn't just some technical malfunction or disaster. It was an invasion. The creatures were not attacking in the way anyone expected. They weren't just destroying things. They were erasing them, like they were wiping the world clean, one city at a time. Her team worked quickly to track the energy pulses they had detected in the first days of the invasion. They knew the creatures' technology was powerful, more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. But now, it seemed like they had perfected it. The team had always suspected that the creatures weren't just manipulating the airwaves or electromagnetic fields. They were doing something far more sinister, altering the very fabric of reality itself. Dr. Park stared at her screens, piecing together the puzzle. The silence wasn't a passive act. It was a weapon. And as the reports continued to flood in, she realized that the creatures' power was not just in their ability to control technology. It was in their ability to manipulate time and space. Meanwhile, the world's remaining military forces scrambled to respond, but the attacks weren't traditional. There were no massive explosions or direct confrontations. Instead, entire buildings, neighborhoods, and even regions of cities were simply gone. They didn't crumble. They didn't burn. They just vanished, as though they had never existed. It was in Paris that the full scale of the creature's ability became terrifyingly clear. The French government had tried to rally the people, organizing defenses and mobilizing the military. They set up barricades, prepared their weapons, and sent out scouts to gather information about the source of the attacks. But when the first strike hit, it wasn't a wave of destruction. It was an eerie, pinpoint strike. A single, tiny section of the city, the size of a city block, suddenly disappeared. No explosion, no sound, just a brief, silent flash, and then the buildings, the streets, the people were gone. The military quickly mobilized, but they found nothing. No debris, no signs of a struggle, just a perfect empty space where once a thriving part of the city had stood. The area surrounding it wasn't even affected. It was as if the creatures had simply erased a part of Paris from existence, and the rest of the world carried on as if nothing had ever happened. Dr. Park felt a growing dread in her gut as she processed the data. These creatures weren't just erasing parts of Earth, they were erasing people, erasing history itself. The world was at their mercy, and no one knew how to fight back. How could you fight an enemy that didn't destroy? It simply wiped you from existence. As the attacks continued to spread across the globe, more cities fell victim to the same eerie silence. New York, Tokyo, Cairo, all once bustling metropolises, now ghost towns. No warnings, no battles, just empty streets where people had lived, loved, worked. But Dr. Park wasn't ready to give up yet. She knew that understanding the creature's method was the first step toward defeating them. They didn't need traditional weapons to win. They had something far more terrifying, an understanding of the very forces that governed the world. Space, time, existence. The creatures weren't just invaders. They were the architects of their own strange, silent reality. And humanity, caught unawares, was at the mercy of their terrifying power. Dr. Park gathered her team together, determined to find a way to stop the erasure before it was too late. They had to understand the creature's technology, their mindset, if they were going to fight back. They needed to know how the creatures could bend the very laws of physics, because if they didn't, the next attack might erase the very memory of Earth itself, and that would be a loss from which there would be no return. The lost civilization. The world had been plunged into chaos, and yet there was still one thing that everyone seemed to forget amid the fear and destruction: the silence itself. The creatures had erased entire cities, wiped people from existence, but in the quiet that followed, there was something else, a deep, buried secret. Dr. Emily Park's team had discovered it before the attacks began, a hidden civilization, long forgotten, buried beneath the earth. And now, in the ruins of a world that had once been full of life, that secret was about to be uncovered. Dr. Park stood before the cracked stone walls of the ancient underground city they had found weeks earlier. The walls were covered in intricate markings, some so worn down by time that they were nearly impossible to decipher. But they weren't just symbols. The team had discovered something more profound, something terrifying. The markings were a form of communication, but not one that was familiar. The more Dr. Park studied them, the more she realized the truth. These creatures, the ones now erasing humanity from existence, were not aliens from another star system. They were the descendants of a long-lost civilization, one that had been buried beneath the earth for millennia. As the team ventured deeper into the ruins, the air grew heavier, thick with the weight of history and a strange, unsettling presence. It wasn't just that the place felt old. It felt alive, as if the very walls were watching them, waiting for them to unlock their secrets. They were at the heart of a lost world, a civilization that had once ruled the planet, only to disappear without a trace. "We were never meant to find this," one of the engineers muttered as he wiped his brow. His voice echoed in the vast, hollow chambers, and for a moment, the sound felt strangely amplified, as if the city itself was listening. "This place is too perfect, too ancient. It's not just technology. It's something else." Dr. Park could feel the weight of his words. What was hidden in the depths of this forgotten world could hold the key to understanding everything. The creatures, their motivations, and the true nature of the power they wielded. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon something that would change everything. A massive circular chamber with an enormous stone slab at its center. As the team gathered around, Dr. Park stepped forward, carefully inspecting the ancient carvings on the surface. The symbols were more complex than anything they had seen before, and yet they seemed eerily familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as a realization dawned on her. The markings weren't just a form of communication. They were instructions. A sudden violent tremor shook the ground, causing dust and debris to fall from the ceiling. The walls seemed to groan in protest, as if the very city itself was waking up. The slab at the center of the chamber began to move, slowly, as though it had been waiting for centuries to be uncovered. The air crackled with energy as a low hum began to reverberate through the room. It was as if the city had a heartbeat of its own, pulsing in time with their discoveries. Without warning, the slab shifted, revealing a hidden passageway beneath the surface. The deep black void awaited them. The team stood frozen, hesitant to move forward. But Dr. Park's instincts told her this was it, the breakthrough they had been searching for. She took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The passage was long, winding, and narrow, its walls lined with strange, glowing markings that pulsed with an unnatural light. It felt like they were walking through the veins of a living organism, each step echoing through the endless tunnel. The deeper they went, the more the sense of unease grew. The very air around them felt thick, as though it was pushing back, resisting their presence. At the end of the passage, they arrived at another vast chamber, one that dwarfed the others they had seen. But this time, the room wasn't empty. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, towering structure, an artifact that seemed both ancient and terrifyingly advanced. It hummed with energy, and as Dr. Park drew closer, she realized what it was. A machine, one unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The machine was a fusion of organic and mechanical components, its surface smooth and reflective, like glass, yet it pulsed with a faint, eerie light. The air around it crackled, and the walls of the chamber began to vibrate in response. Dr. Park reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the surface. A surge of energy shot through her, and for a brief moment, she saw flashes of the past, a time when this civilization had ruled the earth, when these creatures had been gods among men. But it wasn't just a vision of the past, it was a warning. The machine, as it turned out, wasn't just a relic of a lost civilization, it was the source of the creature's power. It had been built to control the very forces of nature, to bend the world itself to their will. And now, the creatures were awakening it once more. "This is it," Dr. Park whispered, her heart racing. "This is why they came." The silence wasn't just about watching us. It was about activating this machine. They're waking up their ancestors' power, and they're going to use it to erase us completely. The team exchanged fearful glances, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The creatures weren't just invaders, they were returning to reclaim what was once theirs. And the lost civilization, long buried beneath the earth, was about to rise again. As the hum of the machine grew louder, Dr. Park knew they had little time. The creatures had found what they were looking for, and if they didn't stop them now, humanity would be lost, erased from existence, just like the cities before them. The only question now was, could they stop what had been set into motion centuries ago? The nightmare awakens. The hum of the ancient machine had filled the chamber, its energy vibrating through the air like a distant storm approaching. It was a sound that seemed to echo deep within Dr. Emily Park's bones, a reminder of the terrible power now stirring beneath their feet. The creatures, having lain dormant for centuries, were finally awakening, and with them, the nightmare that had once consumed an entire world. Dr. Park's breath caught in her throat as she studied the machine. It was more than just a relic. It was a key that unlocked the very fabric of reality itself. She had seen the visions, glimpsed the ancient civilizations rise and fall. They had built this machine not just for control, but for survival. The creatures, once gods among men, had crafted it to shape the world to their will, to bend the laws of nature in their favor. And now, it was working again. The silence was not just a weapon. It was a trigger. Outside the underground facility, the world was on the brink of collapse. Cities had been emptied, entire regions erased from existence. Governments had fallen into chaos, unable to understand or counter the force that had descended upon them. The creatures had revealed their power, and humanity was no longer a force to be reckoned with. Dr. Park and her team knew that the time for survival was running out. The machine, now activated, was not only a source of the creature's power, it was an amplifier. It wasn't just erasing parts of Earth, it was reshaping them, altering time and space, creating rifts in reality that humans had no hope of understanding. The creature's nightmare wasn't just about the past, it was about creating a new one, a reality where humanity was nothing more than a distant memory. As Dr. Park stood before the machine, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The creatures weren't just invaders, they were the last remnants of an ancient race, one that had once ruled Earth, but had been driven into hiding, their very existence forgotten by the world above. Now, they had returned, not to conquer, but to reclaim what had once been theirs. "We have to stop them," one of the engineers whispered, his voice shaky. "If we don't, there won't be anything left. The creatures will reshape the world as they see fit, and we'll be wiped from it." Dr. Park nodded, her mind racing. She had always known that the creatures were powerful, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The very air seemed to pulse with their presence, each breath drawing her deeper into their web of control. But she couldn't let fear stop her now. She had to act. As she turned to her team, she gave them one last command. "We're going to the heart of their power. We need to find a way to shut down the machine. If we don't, the nightmare will continue. It will spread." Without waiting for a response, Dr. Park led the way, her steps echoing in the silent underground halls. The creature's presence was palpable, like a shadow stretching over everything. They were near. She could feel it in the air, the tension building as the machine hummed louder, vibrating with an energy that threatened to tear the world apart. The team moved quickly, but there was no hiding from the inevitable. The creatures had already started to spread their influence, faint whispers in the wind, brief glimpses of their shifting forms in the corners of their vision. They were watching, waiting, and if they didn't act soon, the world would be lost. It wasn't long before they reached the core of the ancient city. The chamber was enormous, its walls lined with massive, pulsating structures, each one a part of the creature's complex system of control. The floor was covered in ancient symbols, and in the center of it all stood the heart of the machine, a massive, glowing sphere that throbbed with power. "This is it," Dr. Park whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machine. "This is where it all began." The air around them seemed to warp and twist, as if reality itself was bending under the machine's influence. Dr. Park reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the sphere. A sharp pulse of energy shot through her, and in that instant, the world around her seemed to blur. She saw flashes of ancient times, when the creatures had ruled the earth, when they had been unstoppable. Their civilization had been vast, powerful, and all-consuming, but it had fallen. And now, they were back. "We can't stop them just by destroying this thing," Dr. Park said, turning to her team. We need to sever their connection to the machine. We need to disconnect them from their power source. One of the soldiers stepped forward, gripping his weapon tightly. How do we do that? How do we fight something like this? Dr. Park took a deep breath. We do what they never expected us to do. We fight with the very thing they fear most. We fight with time. She quickly accessed the data on her wrist communicator, pulling up a series of diagrams. This machine doesn't just control power, it controls the flow of time itself. We can use its own design against them. If we can find a way to reverse the flow, we can collapse their entire system. It was a long shot, and they didn't have much time. The creatures were already beginning to stir, their eerie presence pressing in from all sides. But Dr. Park's resolve was clear. If they were going to survive, this was the only chance they had. With a deep breath, she turned to face the glowing sphere once more. The nightmare was no longer a distant fear. It was here. And now it was up to them to stop it, before the world as they knew it was erased forever. The final choice. The machine pulsed like a beating heart, its glow casting long, shifting shadows against the ancient stone walls. Dr. Emily Park stood before it, her hands trembling as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. This was it. The moment where everything would be decided, not just for her, not just for her team, but for all of humanity. The silence around her wasn't empty. It was filled with something else, something alive. The creatures were watching. They had no eyes, no mouths, no form that the human mind could truly comprehend. Yet their presence was suffocating. She could feel them, pressing against the edges of reality, waiting for her to make a choice. The machine was their lifeline, their anchor to this world. If she destroyed it, they would be severed from their power. But the machine wasn't just their source of control. It had become entangled with the fabric of reality itself. Shutting it down wouldn't just weaken them. It could tear existence apart. Dr. Park swallowed hard. Her team stood behind her, waiting for her command. Some were soldiers, gripping their weapons tightly even though they knew bullets wouldn't stop the creatures. Others were scientists, their eyes filled with the same fear that burned in her own heart. None of them knew if they were about to save the world or destroy it. The creatures shifted in the darkness, their forms flickering like shadows cast by an invisible fire. They weren't attacking. They weren't stopping her. They were waiting. And then, without warning, a voice, not spoken, not heard, but felt, echoed in her mind. You are not meant to be here. Dr. Park clenched her jaw. And yet, here I am. A deep vibration rumbled through the chamber, like distant thunder. The machine's glow intensified. And suddenly, they stepped forward. For the first time, she saw them fully. They weren't monstrous. They weren't grotesque. They were ancient, tall, fluid, shifting beings, their bodies pulsing with an energy that was both beautiful and terrifying. They had no distinct features, yet somehow she knew they were looking at her. We have waited long enough, the voice whispered in her mind. The cycle must begin again. Humanity was never meant to rule this world. Dr. Park took a step forward, her fists clenched. You're wrong. You had your time. You lost your world. And now, you want to take ours. The air around her grew heavier. The walls trembled. We do not take. We restore. Dr. Park's mind raced. The machine wasn't just their power source. It was a reset switch, a way to undo everything. The erasures of the cities, the disappearances, the silence. It was all part of a larger plan. They weren't just conquering Earth. They were reshaping it back into what it had been before humans ever walked the planet. She turned to her team. We have to shut it down. Now. One of the engineers hesitated. But if we do, we don't know what will happen. The power running through this thing, it's connected to everything. If we overload it, we cooled. We could what? One of the soldiers cut in. Blow up the planet. Lose the fight anyway. We're already losing. The creatures took another step forward. You cannot stop what has already begun. Dr. Park met their gaze, if they even had one. Watch me. She turned to the engineer. Do it. He hesitated only a second longer before rushing to the machine's control panel. His fingers flew over the ancient symbols, deciphering their meaning as quickly as he could. The machine began to pulse violently, its glow fluctuating, its hum rising in pitch. The creatures did not move. You are making a mistake. Dr. Park ignored them. How much longer? She demanded. Almost there. The engineer gritted through his teeth. Just a few more. The chamber shook. The walls cracked. The creatures flickered. The air itself bent around them, as if reality was trying to correct something that had gone terribly, terribly wrong. And then, the machine let out a high-pitched whine, one so intense it made their bones vibrate. And then, with a final flash of blinding light, it collapsed. The glow vanished. The hum ceased. The silence returned. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. And then the creatures began to fade. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. They simply flickered, their forms unraveling like shadows dissolving in the morning sun. The cycle will never end, the voice whispered one last time. And then they were gone. The chamber, once pulsating with energy, was now dark and lifeless. The machine, once a terrifying force of nature, was now nothing more than dead metal. Dr. Park let out a shaky breath. They had won. But as she turned to her team, she saw the expressions on their faces. Something was wrong. The silence remained. Outside, the world had changed. The sky was darker. The air was heavier. The stars above, once familiar and bright, were no longer in their rightful places. Reality itself had been altered. And as Dr. Park took one trembling step forward, she realized that while they had stopped the creatures, they had not stopped what had already begun. Something else was waiting in the silence. And this time, it might be worse. The legacy of silence. The world was not the same. Dr. Emily Park stepped out of the underground ruins, her breath hitching as she looked up at the sky. The stars. Wrong. The constellations had shifted, twisted into unfamiliar patterns that no human had ever recorded. The sky itself had taken on an eerie, muted tone, as if the atmosphere was struggling to remember what it was supposed to be. The silence remained, but it wasn't the same unnatural hush that had come with the creature's invasion. This was different, heavier, waiting. Her team stood beside her, their faces pale in the ghostly half-light. They had shut down the machine. The creatures had vanished, but the world hadn't gone back to normal. If anything, it felt like reality itself was. Unfinished. A soldier, still gripping his useless rifle, spoke first. Did we win? His voice sounded distant, as if space itself had stretched between them. No one had an answer. The last time they had heard the creature's voice, it had spoken a warning. The cycle will never end. But what if it wasn't just a warning? What if it was a fact? Dr. Park turned toward the ruins behind them. The ancient city, once alive with impossible energy, now lay still. The machine, the creature's source of power, was nothing but a dead husk. But as she watched, something gnawed at the edges of her mind. A question she had been too afraid to ask until now. What if they hadn't stopped the creatures? What if they had simply erased them from this version of reality? She took a cautious step forward. The earth beneath her boots felt off, not soft, not hard, just wrong, like the ground was pretending to be solid, as if it wasn't entirely real. The engineer beside her, the one who had shut down the machine, spoke hesitantly. I think we broke something. Dr. Park turned to him. What do you mean? He swallowed, his eyes darting to the sky. This silence. It's not because they're gone. It's because something else is settling into place. It hit her all at once. They had stopped the creatures, but the machine had already begun rewriting the world. The process wasn't reversed. It was unfinished. The creatures had been removed, but the world they had been trying to reshape had been left in flux. And then she noticed something else. The horizon. It wasn't moving. No wind stirred the trees. No clouds drifted. The air was still, not in an eerie, unnatural way, but in a way that felt incomplete. Reality was frozen. Or worse, recalculating. Her stomach twisted. "We didn't win," she whispered. "We just interrupted something bigger." One of the soldiers turned in a slow circle, his face full of dawning horror. "Then where the hell are we?" The world they had fought to save, the earth they had known, was gone. This place, whatever it was something new. A remnant of what had come before, a world caught mid-transition. And as the silence stretched on, a new fear settled into Dr. Park's heart. If the creatures had been rewriting the world into their own version of reality, and that process had been interrupted, then what was taking their place? For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Dr. Park truly understood the meaning of fear. Because silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the sound of something waiting to be born.